Percy Jackson is finally here. I have been a fan of the Percy Jackson series since I was a kid. I actually have the books right behind me here. And I've read all the books and series, and of course I saw the movies when they came out. And now we finally have an adaptation that does justice to the material with this new series. Personally, I feel like it can be a bit better, but it's way better than the movies, that's for sure. And since I'm a history channel, I decided to ride the Percy wave. And so today we're going to be looking at the weapons and armor of Camp Half-Blood and ancient Greece. So remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on Instagram and Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, all that good stuff, and let's get right into it. So first, let's set the parameters and historical fantasy context for this. For those who don't know, the Percy Jackson series of books takes place in the modern day, but the basic idea is that the Greek pantheon of gods and figures migrate with the centers of power of the Western world. So now the gods live in America, and Mount Olympus is above the Empire State Building. The gods still have kids with mortals, and as such, there are various demigods running around. These demigods find refuge at a place called Camp Half-Blood, where they train to fight monsters and the various antagonists of Greek mythology that still roam the earth. In terms of gear, the Half-Bloods have ancient Greek weapons, but they often have special abilities and can turn into different objects, usually everyday modern objects, for transport. For example, Percy's weapon is Riptide, a sword that can morph into a pen when not in use, and returns to Percy's pocket even if he loses it. The weapons are generally made out of celestial bronze, a magic material that only affects the Greek mythos figures and can't harm mortals, but it can still harm Half-Bloods. There are other materials as well, namely Stygian iron, which is kind of more associated with Hades and death and dark magic, so it's not as common as celestial bronze. So this all begs the question, what exactly are the Greek weapons and armor to choose from? Greek society wasn't just one specific place in time, but instead lasted for centuries, almost 2,000 years. While we tend to think of the hoplite as the epitome of Greek warrior fighting and 300 and Leonidas, we know from history that there were many different evolutions and styles of Greek warrior. So let's rewind a few centuries to the start of Greek civilization with the Mycenaeans. The Minoans are considered the first great civilization in Greece, starting around 2800 BC, but they were distinct from Greeks with a totally different language, religion, and customs. As such, we don't really count them. Anyways, by 1750 BC or so, the Mycenaeans swept in from Europe, starting the Mycenaean or Palatial period of Greek history, named for the fortified palace-centric system that defined this very warlike society. Mycenae, along with other power city centers, were able to organize militaries of elites and common people fighting each other and foreign groups, most notably the Trojans. Their weaponry, however, was very different from the hoplites we usually think of. The elite Mycenaean soldiers were hecatai, which was the term for nobles, and they could afford better equipment and horses for themselves. In the coastal regions of Anatolia, which were also Greek, these soldiers were mounted or used chariots, while further west, there seems to be a trend of them dismounting to actually fight. War dogs were also used in the east as well. Mycenaeans surprisingly appear to not have used shields at all, and to compensate for this they used longer spears, maybe 10 feet long, with bronze heads. Swords of the era varied significantly, and since specific names are lost to time, if they ever even existed, we often refer to them via typologies, and in this video I'm mostly relying on the Sanders typology. Some of the earliest Mycenaean swords, around 1700 BC, were Type A swords. Made of bronze and double-edged, these weapons resembled rapiers with lengthy, sharply pointed blades with thick cross-sections between 32 and 44 inches long. Like many Bronze Age swords, they didn't have crossguards, and instead the handle flowed into the wider blade. Unsurprisingly, the length wasn't terribly efficient, and shorter blades existed as well, ranging from daggers to other swords on the typology, like the Type B, which were similar to A's in shape but with thinner cross-sections and were much shorter, usually between 10 and 14 inches. Type C swords emerged by the mid-1400s BC and featured horns creating a swept hilt, and blade lengths around 26 inches or so, but longer and shorter variants existed as well. Type D swords with the beginnings of cross hilts emerged at this time as well, with blades around 22 inches long, and Type E swords barely made it past dagger length, but were more so a continuation of A and B styles and were around 13 inches long. Additionally, single-edged swords existed as well, and there seems to have been two types. One was more curved, and the other was almost half leaf-shaped. These are types 1 and 2 respectively, and then these sort of seemed to disappear for a while until the classical era. Bows were prominent as well and came in various styles, including simple long-type bows, composite reflex bows, and double-curved bows, as well as slings. These ranged weapons would more or less stay the same throughout Greek history. The vast majority of soldiers wouldn't be armored, with lower-ranking men wearing some sort of skirt or kilt, while higher-ranking soldiers wore tunics and occasionally helmets made of boar tusk covering the head and cheeks. Textile helmets made of linen or hide existed as well, some look kind of funny looking. There is an example of heavy bronze armor from the time as well, which covered the chest, shoulders, neck, and thighs, but this is so rare that it's unknown if it would have actually even been used at all. By the mid-1200s BC, Mycenae would decline in power, and an era known as the Post-Palatial period emerges. Yet another long span of time. We see in this period a marked decentralization in equipment. Since centralized political power had ebbed, it is thought that most engagements were smaller, only with a few hundred men, and mostly consisted of noble elites rather than large commoner armies that had to be paid. Notably, shields began to show up, often being larger and in a variety of shapes. Rectangular, oblong, round, and even dipylon style with the cutouts on either side emerged as a common form of protection. These shields had a single grip in the center, which, while simpler and easier for small shields, may have been cumbersome for larger ones. But with this added protection, the rest of Greek fighting evolved. Spears now came in a variety of lengths, often as short as 5 feet, and were better equipped for dual-purpose use of holding as well as throwing. Some men stuck to using one long spear, while many moved to 2 shorter spears. Once again, swords saw some major evolution. While Type D and E swords saw some refinement with wider pommels, Type Fs emerged in the 1000s BC, lacking a crossguard and on the shorter side, maybe 16 inches generally. Type Gs come about around the same time with flanged hilts, similar to C types but shorter, usually around 18 inches. The main sword, however, became the Now II, an Italian import that spread across Central and Southern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1200s BC. Featuring a rounded or angled hilt that expanded into the blade, these swords were sometimes lobed, making them better at cutting, and between 20 and 28 inches long. More notably, by 1000 BC, these swords started to be made with iron, and the age of bronze swords was over. There was even some experimentation with armor, with bronze helmets as well as greaves, sometimes made of linen and sometimes also having smaller pieces of bronze. By around 1000 BC, Greece entered a dark age, with even less centralization and a marked decline in farming output as well as written sources. While shields remained, spears tended towards the shorter side, and it was standard for fighters to carry 2 or 3 of them. Swords persisted but likely became less common, and armor almost entirely disappeared. Many men fought naked, and some used leather or textile caps to protect their heads. Keep in mind, these aren't necessarily commoners even, these are the nobles of a given Greek city-state area, and they're the ones fighting naked. Things were looking up by around 750 BC, and the political centers that we tend to think of in Greece started to rise, namely Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, and Athens. A new political system of the polis, or city-state, emerged, helping to re-centralize power and military affairs. At the same time, the Bronze Age was coming to an end, which ironically supercharged its use since it was devalued by iron in the Iron Age. Uniformity began to re-emerge with re-centralization, and shields got an upgrade, switching to a two-grip system that went on the forearm, making use far more efficient, especially for larger shields. The classic Greek aspis shield finally emerged at this time, being convex with a distinguished brim, round of course, sometimes coated in bronze, and around 30 plus inches in width. Bronze helmets emerge in full force, first with Kegel helms, which just look kind of like cones, and then Illyrian helmets, which protected the cheeks and neck. The famous Corinthian helmet emerges by the late 700s as well, covering much of the head except for the eyes and mouth, and this was the most common helmet for a lot of Greek history going forward. The classic bronze cuirass and bronze greaves became more popular as well. Although naked troops still existed, they even started wearing clothes again sometimes. In terms of armor, what we think of as Greek was more or less complete, but the weapons were still evolving. Spears went back to the Post-Palatial system, where some had two smaller spears and some had a single larger one, and bronze swords were still longer with flowing hilts. Within a century, even more innovation emerged. Some level of specialization developed, often distinguishing between gymnates, naked javelin troops, and panoply, armored troops. More dedicated javelin spears also emerged, so they were a bit shorter with lighter heads. Armor also started to optimize for flexibility and ergonomics. The Corinthian helmet developed ear cutouts to make commands easier to hear, and the Illyrian helmet emerged first in Western Anatolia, and this featured hinged cheek protection and less face and head cover to make vision easier. By the late 500s, the Chalcidian helmet emerged, similar to an earless Corinthian style, but with even less face protection for the cheeks, and a variant of this called the Attic style got rid of the nose guard. On the body, there was a move towards linothorax cuirasses made from linen, giving more flexibility and comfort but less protection. Sometimes these linothoraxes would have bronze bands or scales as well to retain some of that protection. On rare occasion, richer nobles would wear thigh or arm guards. Through all this time, it's worth noting that Greek tactics were more a hodgepodge in nature. Troops of various specialties would fight together, cavalry next to spearmen, archers using infantry shields for cover. Some specialized units existed and fought together, especially slingers, but by and large the Greek units were flexible and very diversified, generally well armored and capable of fighting in smaller, versatile groups. So this is the closest thing to what we would think of as maybe like a Camp Half-Blood style of fighting. But this starts to change in the 500s BC, around the time of the shift from the Archaic period to the Classical period. The phalanx appears, possibly due to the advent of larger armies and contact with the Persians, who had found it effective to divide the different types of groups. 8 ranks deep, the phalanx, while lacking the versatility of previous Greek tactics, was extremely good in melee combat. A good example of this is the Battle of Marathon in 490 AD, when the Athenians faced the Persians. I also made a video about that, go check that out here. And the Battle of Syracuse decades later, which you can watch here. I made another video on that. Anyways, while the phalanx and the hoplites that fought in it, yes, were finally at hoplites, they're called hoplites around this time, while they lacked ranged capability, their armor and shields protected them while closing the distance. Once they were close, there was seldom an enemy that could defeat them. So, what did the classical Greek hoplite look like? Well, since they're no longer engaged in ranged combat, hoplites didn't need throwing spears. Instead, they moved to the classic dory, which had dual iron heads in case it broke or to finish off downed enemies, and the spear was about 10 feet long. Around this time, we see the portrayal of petruges, or the famous linen war skirts. These were linen or leather strips or cords, usually in multiple rows, and would cover the thighs and sometimes the shoulders. Other than this, the armor stayed the same, but the sword was different. The Now II, which disappeared around the end of the 500s along with chariots, was replaced by two main swords. For infantry, the Xiphos blade carried on the leaf shape of the Now II, but featured a crossguard and was shorter, usually between 12 to 18 inches. Also, just a side note, Xiphos just means sword in Greek, so it's not like a specific sword name, it's just what we call it now. You could technically call all these swords a Xiphos, but we tend to think of the hoplite sword as a Xiphos, because, you know, history. On horseback, the kopis, also called a machaira, emerged, sporting a single-edged, heavily lobed blade that was optimal for downward slashes on enemies. The blade was curved forward somewhat and was in the mid-20-inch range, while the handle was in a sort of C shape, providing some protection to the hand. And that famous 300 sword you're thinking of did not exist. It was supposed to be a kopis, but it's not a real thing. With regards to skirmisher troops, a new class of warrior emerged known as the peltast. Peltasts were skirmishers, often not armored, and used ranged weapons, but also used a pelty shield, which was in a crescent shape made of wicker and hide. It's also around the 400s that we get the rise of a new ranged weapon, the gastrophides. This was a crossbow that was braced against the stomach, although how common it was is questionable given its long time to prepare and thus, of course, inappropriate for mobile forces, who were the main people using missile weapons. But that's not all. Greek weaponry evolved even more after the classical era, which can be said to have ended in 336 BC, when Philip of Macedon conquered Greece for himself. With this came new weapons and tactics. These weapons and tactics characterized Alexander the Great's conquests and saw even more changes in fighting. I made a video on this as well, looking at Alexander's victory at Gaugamela, so check that out here. If we can characterize the trend of Greek infantry since the 700s BC, it has been a trend of lightening armor and lengthening spears. As it turns out, that perpetuates through here to the new class of warrior, the phalangite. Linothoraxes became the armor of the day, and the helmets moved towards the Phrygian style, with a big lobe on the head and hinged cheek protection. The shield got smaller, only about 2 feet wide, and was usually strapped around the shoulder or the neck rather than being held. That's because the Macedonians used a much longer pike that needed 2 hands. The sarissa, as it was known, was between 15 to 20 feet long and sported a larger bronze head at the rear to help counterbalance, while the main head was iron. Hoplites didn't totally go away, but they were now called hippapists and served as a smaller, flexible group of fighters, similar to the war bands of the Dark Ages. But they still sported Phrygian helmets, so that's the main difference. Cavalry became a more important element as well, and to be fair, it never totally went away, but during this time, horse armor existed. The Boeotian-style helmets were worn, which had less drag than the infantry counterparts, obviously, and the main weapon was the Z-stone lance, which was pretty much the same as the earlier dory. Machieras were still used as well, but are thought to have been a bit shorter now, closer to 18 inches or so. As you may imagine, these changes in weapons, especially for the phalangites, saw a change in tactics, and you would be right. The Macedonian phalanx was 16 ranks deep instead of 8, and since the sarissa was so long, the first 5 ranks had their spears protruding towards the enemy. Unsurprisingly, the sarissa would have been a horrible weapon to use one-on-one, and it was great for these large formations. Further, the armies were even more centralized, and instead of a warrior being loyal to their local city-state, they pledged loyalty to the Macedonian king himself. But with Alexander's death in 323 BC, his empire fractured into pieces, and the various Hellenistic kingdoms did their best to hold on to power. From From here, Greek warfare changes more so in organization than weaponry. Since the empire was so big, it meant that Greeks weren't the only fighters in the armies anymore, and as such, mercenary groups became far more common. Some of these groups were still Greek, but many were locals from Egypt or Persia or Mesopotamia or Bactria, and they would often be equipped in Greek fashion. In general, troops tended to get lighter, and skirmisher-style mercenaries became more common. A sort of in-between style troop, the Thyrophoroi, I'm sure I said that right. The Thyrophori, I don't know, emerged equipped with the same armor as phalangites, but sported a larger oblong-style shield called the Thyreos, and moving to an older version of shorter, multi-purpose spears, which they would often carry more than one of. These troops were usually foreign and served as skirmishers, but also had the ability to fight in the phalanx, similar to Hypapists. These heavier armored groups, however, the Hypapists, became less common, and during this era, only powerful polities in mainland Greece ever saw anything like hoplites anymore. Phalangites largely stayed the same, but formations seem to have gotten larger, and a quantity over quality approach was taken. Oftentimes, troops in the center of the phalanx weren't even armored at all. Also around this time, we see some innovation in sling weapons. Sestrofendone weighted darts were created to be slung, and another form of sling that incorporates a stick for increased leverage was used, allowing for firing larger stones, especially at shorter ranges. By the 3rd century, the Greek kingdoms started to disappear. Ptolemy in Macedonia fell to Rome, Seleucia to the Parthians, Bactria, well, to the Bactrians, modern Afghanistan, while the Greek influence still lived on and would play a massive role in shaping Rome, Byzantium, and the Islamic world centuries later. The days of the true Greek warriors was over. So now that we know all that, here's a look at the various armor and weapons available to the demigods of Camp Half-Blood. Also, if you were in the Percy Jackson universe, I'm curious, and talk about this in the comments section, what weapons and armor would you choose as your loadout? I know I used to think about this a lot when I was younger, and now that I'm doing the research, I'm thinking about it all over again. And I'm curious what you all thought about for magic items, and maybe what historically Greek weapons you would want. Personally, I liked the now 2 sword, because it was just, iron and like a good length, and it was still leaf-shaped, so I thought it was pretty cool. Anyways, with an arsenal this diverse, it's hard to say that a given weapon or helmet or whatever is totally unrealistic, even if we can point out that the various equipment isn't contemporary. Let's start with the main weapon in the series, Riptide or Anaklusmus. This is Percy's main sword, and it's been portrayed differently in the variety of media. This portrayal is wildly inconsistent. It changes between the book covers, between the 2 movies, between the side books and comic books, the descriptions in the books, and of course the TV show. So let's just look at the TV show today, and I have to say that while I was originally skeptical, after some research, this may be the most historically accurate version of the sword to date. If we look at the hilt, we see that there isn't a crossguard, but rather a lobed, sort of Y goblet-shaped hilt with a rondelle pommel. This is consistent with a now 2 sword. In fact, it looks directly copied from this example found in Schleswig in northern Germany. The main issue I see with that is that this type isn't typical of Greek now 2 swords, which tended to be more angular and have horned pommels instead of rondelles. That being said, there are examples of Greek swords with rondelles, like this sword from the 1400s BC. Also, the Perseus statue in the first episode has been edited to have Percy's sword, and the real statue is a different sword. I just thought that was a cool little touch. This still may be the most historically accurate version for one major reason. Most of the other versions and descriptions of Riptide resemble a Xiphos, albeit a long Xiphos, like in the Crown of Ptolemy, where Riptide is said to be 3 feet long. That's definitely way too long for a Xiphos. Its blade is described as leaf-shaped in the Sun and Neptune, and the hilt is described as flat in the Lightning Thief, so this kind of checks out as just like an overly long Xiphos. But the snag is that the Xiphoses were never made of bronze. By the time these swords came around in the 6th century BC, the Greeks made their swords from iron. So a celestial bronze Xiphos wouldn't actually make sense historically, and ironically, the PJ movies may get it more right by making it look iron, even if it's a bit long and they say it's bronze, but it's obviously iron. It's dumb movies, I know. Now, let's look at Clarice's spear, which in The Lightning Thief is described to be 5 feet long, which would be totally in line with earlier spears from the Post-Palatial all the way to the Archaic periods, and then again emerging in the Hellenic period. The spearhead is pretty plain, minus the electric effect, and the spearheads for much of Greek history were made of bronze, so this checks out, although by the time of hoplites, they're iron. The shaft, of course, should be made of wood, not whatever this kind of coating is, and there is a counterweight at the back that sort of resembles the flanges on a sarissa pike, which doesn't make sense since the spear is just way too short for a counterweight, and you couldn't throw it with that. It doesn't make sense why you'd have that there. If we look at Annabeth's dagger, we can see that it's a bit shorter than in the books, where it is just described as, quote, long. The Greeks, like every civilization, had daggers, but these shared the same role as a short sword, although they seem to have been more common in civilian life than swords. Looking at Annabeth's blade type, we can quickly see that this isn't very realistic. The hilt looks alright, and even the thickness, especially for type FC blades, which are described as being more thick, but the main issue is that it's combining a blade style of a sword with the length of a short dagger. Here we can see the dagger is maybe, 6 inches long, and while blades this short did exist, they tended to be just more triangular. The leaf shape of the blade is meant for maximizing cutting power, but this blade is just way too short to be able to benefit at all from any cutting power, so there's just no benefit to that shape. To make this more realistic, they could either lengthen the dagger to resemble the historical Type F blade, maybe 13 inches double the length, or change the shape of it to be more triangular, which is kind of how it seems to be in the books and a lot of the other media. There also probably would have been some pommel on it at the end. The series isn't over yet as of me recording this, so I won't go into everything, but quickly, we can look at other weapons and armor that we see. Ares' sword is obviously not Greek at all and looks like a European Zweihander or greatsword from the late 1500s in Germany or something. Poseidon's trident would have been used for fishing, and there's no evidence that tridents were ever used in combat outside of gladiator fights in Rome centuries after Greece fell. For Camp Half-Blood gear, the bows look appropriate, as do the bronze cuirasses and helmets, although these are representative of a sort of hybrid late Corinthian and Chalcidian helmet, given the cheek pieces, open ears, and small nose guards. The pauldrons on Luke and Annabeth are totally out of place, but the bracer Annabeth has could be attested to with rare examples. Some people did use these, especially in the Post-Palatial period, but they were rare. Percy seems to be wearing a linothorax, although it's not really the right color, but I don't think the abs would be imprinted on them either. The shields are just definitely too small, closer to the size of Alexandrian era shields. Still too small, I think, but still made of bronze, which wouldn't have been realistic. We also see Clarice's shield has 3 straps, when they would have only had 2 historically, and Percy's shield is like a small Boeotian shield, which may not have existed at all, since it wouldn't be practical to have an already really small shield have even less surface area. We see some copuses as well, including the dreaded 300 style of copus, which is just not accurate. These are on the longer side, but they are made of bronze, which also is inaccurate. Again, copuses and Xiphos would have been made of iron. There's also this Petrusius, which Percy is sporting, which is totally inaccurate since it doesn't cover enough and just wouldn't be very protective. There's no point in something like that. So in short, the general character of most things we see in the show is in the right direction, but most of the details aren't quite there, and that's not too surprising. Honestly, I'm surprised it is that good, especially with Riptide. I'm happy that they I think accidentally made it the most historically accurate version. Even with the length, they got the length down much better than the books. Looking at the evolution of Greek combat, we can see that some elements ebbed and flowed. Long versus short spears came and went, with longer spears emerging when there was better centralization. Armor was very lacking, then progressed to its zenith in the early Archaic period, but then started to become more ergonomic through the Classical and Hellenistic eras once they realized that just min-maxing into straight protection wasn't worth it. Swords were sort of all over the place, but generally got shorter in proportion to spear length, with shorter blades being used more, with longer spears presumably since they were more of backup weapons. So, if you were in the Percy Jackson universe, what weapons would you equip yourself with? I'm honestly curious about your loadouts, so leave some comments about that. That's it for this video, everyone. Thank you all for 3,000 subscribers. Happy 2024 to you all. I have lots of great videos planned for this year. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell. Also follow me on Instagram, X, Twitter, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you so much. Goodbye.